What if I told you the Bible holds secrets that mainstream history has buried? In today's video, we uncover the shocking story of an African god who stood face to face with Moses and humiliated him. A tale so powerful it was deliberately erased from tradition. This isn't just myth or legend. It's a forgotten piece of African spiritual history that challenges everything we thought we knew about the Bible. Why was this god silenced? And what does it mean for us today? Stay tuned, because what you're about to learn will shake your understanding of Scripture and history forever. The mystery hidden in plain sight. The Bible is filled with encounters between humans and the divine, clashes between gods and prophets, and stories of power struggles that shaped faith. Yet, one story, largely hidden and glossed over in mainstream teachings, reveals a shocking moment when Moses, the great prophet of Israel, faced not Pharaoh, but an African god. This mysterious deity humiliated Moses, defying his signs and wonders, and for a moment, Moses seemed powerless. Over time, this episode was erased, dismissed as pagan myth, or buried under theological explanations. But when we peel back the layers of Scripture, ancient history, and African tradition, we find hints of a God so powerful that even Moses trembled. Who was this God? Why was his story suppressed? And what does it mean for how we understand Africa's role in the Bible? Let us explore the forgotten tale of the African God who humiliated Moses and was erased from history. Moses in Africa, the overlooked context. Before we dive into the confrontation, we must remember, Moses spent much of his life in Africa. Egypt, where he was born, raised, and later confronted Pharaoh, is central to the biblical narrative. Egypt is in Africa. When Moses fled Egypt after killing the Egyptian taskmaster, he escaped into the land of Midian. Midian itself bordered northeast Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, showing the fluidity of cultural and spiritual exchanges between Africans and Semitic peoples. But even before the Exodus, Egypt was a land filled with gods: Ammon-Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis, and many more. These gods weren't just myths. They were living realities for the Egyptians. Their priests wielded knowledge of medicine, astronomy, magic, and rituals that rivaled Moses' miraculous signs. Thus, when Moses returned to demand the release of Israel, he wasn't simply confronting Pharaoh. He was entering into a cosmic battlefield between Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the gods of Africa. The clash of powers, Moses versus the magicians. Exodus 7 records a peculiar moment. Moses, with his brother Aaron, throws down his staff before Pharaoh. It becomes a serpent. This was meant to be a sign of divine power. Yet something shocking happens. Then Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers. So the magicians of Egypt, they also did in like manner with their enchantments. For every man threw down his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. Exodus 7 verses 11 to 12. For a moment, Moses was humiliated. The sign of power he thought was unique was replicated by the African priests. Their staffs became serpents too. In front of Pharaoh, Moses looked like just another magician. Though the text insists Aaron's serpents swallowed theirs, the very fact that the African magicians could match him is astounding. This wasn't mere trickery. It was a demonstration of divine or spiritual power. Here, the Bible quietly acknowledges that African gods, or at least their priests, were able to rival Moses, humiliating him before the court. Who was the African god behind the magicians? Scholars and theologians usually dismiss the Egyptian magicians as sorcerers or practitioners of illusion. But Egyptian records, combined with biblical hints, suggest otherwise. These magicians weren't working alone. They were channels of a greater deity. The likely candidate? Heka, the ancient Egyptian god of magic and power. Heka wasn't a minor figure. In Egyptian thought, Heka was the divine force of magic itself, predating even the gods. Every prayer, ritual, or spell was empowered by Heka. The priests of Egypt invoked Heka to channel miraculous power, healing, transformation, and even serpentine magic. Thus, when Moses' staff turned into a serpent and the priests matched him, it was not simply a magic trick. It was Heka, Africa's ancient god of power, standing toe-to-toe with Yahweh's prophet. For a moment, Moses was outshone, humiliated. His miracle was matched by an African god. Why this matters? Africa's forgotten place in the Bible. The Bible, as we often read it, tells the story of Israel in opposition to surrounding nations. Egypt is usually painted as the villain, but the reality is more complex. Africa wasn't just a backdrop. It was a spiritual battleground. Egypt's gods weren't powerless idols. The Bible itself admits they had influence. When Yahweh struck Egypt with plagues, it was not only against Pharaoh, but as Exodus 12 verse 12 declares, "Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment." This means the Bible acknowledges those gods existed and had power. Yahweh didn't fight against illusions. He fought against real forces. So why has this been hidden? Because to admit it means acknowledging that Africa played a central role in the story of divine conflict. It means accepting that African gods were formidable, even humiliating Moses at first. And it means the biblical narrative isn't simply about one god versus empty idols, but about rival divine powers locked in struggle. How the African god was erased. Over time, Jewish and Christian interpreters grew uncomfortable with the idea that Egyptian gods had real power. To preserve the supremacy of Yahweh, they minimized or explained away the role of Egypt's deities. The magicians became tricksters. Their gods were reduced to idols. The humiliation of Moses was glossed over as a temporary setback. By the time Christianity spread through Europe, Egypt's gods were dismissed as pagan superstition. The African god Heka, once considered the cosmic force of magic, was erased from memory. Yet the traces remain in the Bible itself, in Egyptian inscriptions, and in African oral traditions that remember Egypt not only as a kingdom, but as a land of divine power. A deeper symbolism, Moses versus Africa. But there is another layer to this story. Moses himself had an African identity. Raised in Pharaoh's palace, educated in Egyptian wisdom, Moses was more African than Hebrew for most of his early life. Even his marriage connected him to Africa. He was Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest, and later, Numbers 12:1 mentions his marriage to a Cushite Ethiopian woman. Thus, Moses' confrontation with the Egyptian god wasn't just Israel versus Africa. It was Moses facing his own spiritual past. He had been trained in the wisdom of Egypt. Now he had to prove that Yahweh, not the gods of his youth, held ultimate power. The humiliation Moses experienced before Pharaoh was necessary. It forced him to realize that this was not a battle of men, but of gods. Why was Africa's role buried? Why did later history erase the African god who humiliated Moses? Several reasons. Theological control. Judaism and Christianity wanted to emphasize Yahweh's uniqueness. Acknowledging rival gods with real power made theology messy. Colonial narratives. As Europe rose to power, it portrayed Africa as primitive, godless, and superstitious. Highlighting Africa's role in the Bible as a spiritual powerhouse would contradict colonial propaganda. Fear of syncretism. Early church fathers wanted to separate Christianity from pagan influences. Admitting the strength of African gods risked blending traditions. Thus, the African god, Heka, was quietly erased. But erasure is not destruction. The traces still exist for those willing to look. Rediscovering the forgotten truth. Revealing this hidden story matters today for several reasons. It restores Africa's dignity in biblical history. Africa wasn't a passive backdrop, but an active force in the story of salvation. It challenges our understanding of monotheism. The Bible itself shows Yahweh confronting real rival powers, not empty statues. It invites dialogue between traditions. African spirituality and biblical faith share a long, intertwined history. The humbling of Moses reminds us that truth isn't one-sided. Power is contested, and history is written by the victors, who often erase what they find inconvenient. The legacy of the forgotten God. Though erased from official theology, the African God who humiliated Moses continues to echo in subtle ways. The word Heka survives in the Egyptian language, meaning magic or divine utterance. African traditions across the continent still preserve beliefs in spiritual forces of power, healing, and transformation, echoes of Heka's essence. Even in Christianity, the idea of spiritual warfare, angels and demons battling, reflects the ancient reality that divine powers contest each other. Perhaps this is why the Bible itself leaves the episode intact. Though theologians tried to downplay it, the text still records the humiliation. The magicians matched Moses' signs. The truth could not be entirely erased. More than a forgotten story. When we talk about the African God who humiliated Moses, it's tempting to treat it as a historical footnote, an odd detail in Scripture, or a curiosity in Egyptology. But the truth is far bigger. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Why did the Bible preserve the humiliation of Moses, even if briefly? Why did later traditions erase Africa's role in this drama? And most importantly, what does it mean for us, living today in a world still shaped by religion, colonialism, and the struggle over truth? The lesson is not only about the past. It's about how we see ourselves, our faith, our history, and our future. 1. Re-examining the Bible as a living document. For many people, the Bible is treated as a neat, orderly narrative. God is supreme, idols are powerless, and Israel's story dominates the stage. But when we pay attention to the details, the Bible is far more complex. It shows moments of contest, of embarrassment, of tension. The fact that Moses was humiliated by African magicians tells us that Scripture is honest about struggle. Faith is not about a smooth road of easy victories. It's about moments when even prophets face opposition that seems overwhelming. What it means for us today. We must read the Bible with open eyes, not just accepting traditional interpretations. We must allow its difficult moments, like Moses' humiliation, to teach us humility. Faith is not about instant triumphs, but about endurance in the face of powerful opposition. This challenges modern believers to go beyond a simplistic reading of Scripture and to embrace its depth, contradictions, and humanity. 2. Africa's forgotten place in the biblical world. For centuries, Africa was written out of biblical interpretation. Western Christianity painted Africa as dark, pagan, and primitive. Yet the Bible itself places Africa at the very heart of the story. Moses was raised in Africa. Israel's survival during famine depended on Egypt. Prophets like Jeremiah looked to Egypt for refuge. The New Testament records Joseph, Mary, and the baby Jesus fleeing to Africa for safety. The humiliation of Moses by African magicians is another reminder. Africa was not just a backdrop, but a spiritual force to be reckoned with. What it means for us today. African peoples must reclaim their place in sacred history. Christianity and Judaism are not foreign imports to Africa. They were born in dialogue with Africa. Africans and people of African descent can walk with dignity, knowing their ancestors shaped the faiths we practice today. This story pushes back against centuries of colonial erasure and affirms Africa's central role in humanity's encounter with the divine. 3. The reality of spiritual power. One reason this story is uncomfortable is because it acknowledges something modern religion often denies: that rival powers exist. The Egyptian magicians didn't merely perform tricks. They tapped into a real spiritual force, the African god of magic, Heka. In a scientific age, many dismiss this as myth. But across the world, especially in Africa, people still believe in spiritual realities beyond material explanation. Healing, curses, visions, and transformations are not just superstition, but part of lived experience. What it means for us today. We should take spiritual power seriously, without immediately dismissing it. Faith is not about denying the existence of rival powers, but about choosing whom to trust. Humility is required, because spiritual forces can challenge even prophets. In a world hungry for meaning, this story reminds us that the unseen is real, powerful, and contested. 4. Humility in the face of opposition. For Moses, humiliation in Pharaoh's court was a turning point. He realized that his power did not come from himself, but from God. He was not in control, he was a vessel. Today, we live in a culture obsessed with victory, dominance, and personal power. Religion is often marketed as a path to winning, prosperity, success, and triumph over enemies. But the story of Moses' humiliation teaches something different. True faith begins with humility. What it means for us today. Leaders, spiritual or political, must accept that they will be challenged. True authority comes not from showmanship, but from enduring trust in God. Being humiliated is not the end of the story. It may be the beginning of deeper transformation. In our personal lives, this lesson is freeing. We do not need to fear failure. Like Moses, even when we are embarrassed or outmatched, our story is not finished. 5. History is written by the victors. Why was the African god erased from history? Because history is selective. The victors write the narrative, and they erase what makes them uncomfortable. The Israelites recorded Yahweh's victory, but they could not completely erase the moment of humiliation. Later interpreters, however, downplayed it. Colonial powers did the same with Africa's history. They erased Africa's intellectual, spiritual, and cultural contributions, reducing a rich continent to stereotypes. What it means for us today. We must question the official stories we've been told, whether religious, historical, or political. Forgotten voices, especially from Africa and other marginalized cultures, must be recovered. The truth is often hidden not because it is false, but because it is inconvenient. This calls us to be seekers of truth, willing to dig beneath the surface. 6. Interfaith and cross-cultural dialogue. The confrontation between Moses and the African god is also a meeting of worldviews. Instead of seeing African spirituality as merely evil, we can recognize it as part of humanity's search for the divine. Yes, the Bible portrays Yahweh as victorious, but it also acknowledges that African spirituality was powerful, meaningful, and deeply rooted. This is not an invitation to syncretism, but to respect. What it means for us today. Different faiths should be respected as serious engagements with the divine, not dismissed as superstition. Dialogue between Christianity, Judaism, African traditional religions, and Islam can lead to deeper understanding. Recognizing Africa's spiritual heritage can enrich global faith traditions, not threaten them. This story urges us to honor, not erase, the diversity of spiritual expression in human history. 7. Lessons for African Identity and Pride. For people of African descent, this story is a hidden jewel. It shows that their ancestors were not outsiders in the biblical world, but central actors. The humiliation of Moses by African magicians proves that Africa had real power, so much that it had to be confronted. What it means for us today. Africans and the diaspora can embrace their heritage without shame. Christianity and Judaism should be reread with Africa at the center, not the margins. African youth can reclaim confidence, knowing their history is one of wisdom, power, and divine encounter. In a time when identity is under attack, this is a healing truth. 8. Global implications. Power and resistance. On a global scale, the story also reflects the struggle between empires and oppressed peoples. Moses represented a small, enslaved nation. Pharaoh and his gods represented imperial power. Today, the struggle continues. Nations, corporations, and ideologies present themselves as gods. The story of Moses and the African God reminds us that power is always contested, and that the oppressed can rise. What it means for us today. No empire is absolute. Even the greatest powers can be challenged. Resistance requires faith, humility, and persistence. Spiritual battles often reflect social and political struggles. This transforms the story from ancient myth to a living parable for justice and liberation. 9. Rediscovering suppressed stories. The erasure of the African God is not unique. Many stories, especially those involving marginalized peoples, have been hidden, rewritten, or suppressed. By rediscovering them, we do more than correct history. We heal wounds. We honor forgotten ancestors. We open space for new voices. What it means for us today. Churches, schools, and communities should tell suppressed stories openly. Recovering hidden history can empower future generations. Truth-telling is a sacred duty, even when it is uncomfortable. Just as Moses' humiliation still teaches us, so do the forgotten stories of Africa, Asia, the Americas, and beyond. 10. Living with courage and curiosity. Finally, the story calls us to live differently. If even Moses could be humbled by an African God, then we must approach life with humility, courage, and curiosity. What it means for us today. Humility, we don't know everything. Our faith, our history, and our science still have gaps. Courage, we must face opposition without fear, trusting in a higher purpose. Curiosity, we must explore the hidden corners of history, scripture, and culture without prejudice. This way of living makes us seekers, not simply believers. The truth that couldn't be erased. The African God who humiliated Moses may have been erased from official history, but his story remains in the Bible, quietly, stubbornly. It is a story that refuses to die, and it matters for us today. It reminds us that the Bible is more complex than we think. Africa has always been central to the story of faith. Spiritual power is real and must be respected. Humility is essential in the face of opposition. History is selective, and we must recover forgotten voices. Identity, justice, and dignity are rooted in remembering who we truly are. Ultimately, this story is about more than Moses. It is about us. About how we see the world, how we honor Africa's role in history, and how we live with humility and courage in a world still contested by powers, spiritual, political, and cultural. The Bible hid this. History erased it. But we can choose to remember, to learn, and to let this truth shape a new way of living today. The story of the African God who humiliated Moses is more than just a hidden tale. It's a reminder that history is layered with truths we've never been told. Erased, silenced, yet still echoing through time. This story shows us how powerful Africa's spiritual legacy truly is. What else has been hidden, waiting to be uncovered? If this video opened your eyes, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more revelations the world doesn't want you to know. Together, we'll keep unearthing the forgotten chapters of Scripture and history that still shape our lives today. Stay curious, stay awake.